So we just want to say
There we go.
welcome to our final 360 exchange for 2024. We look forward to a lively conversation as always. It's a pleasure to see everyone today. And the first question, I'm going to put them in chat too. I'll ask them and then I'll type them in chat. Um, how should volunteer-led activities be evaluated? And what are some reasonable expectations? Let's see, there we go. Um, what are reasonable expectations for success when volunteers are involved in events? And how do we make certain that the expectations are developed fairly and communicated clearly to the volunteers? So I know that's a mouthful to digest. I'll repeat it once again while you're processing your answers because I know within this group we have some great answers to some of these questions. How should volunteer-led activities be evaluated? What
Mary,
are
can
reasonable?
you give us some examples? Because I think there's a wide range and the answer might be different between different types of events.
And Rob, you just answered your own question, actually. So let me try to provide an off the top of my head example while others are processing. So um, let's use movies for grown-ups because that's something that most of us are familiar with. For a movies for grown-ups event, there's several aspects of that that can be evaluated. The things that are within our control are um, the amount of engagement we have with the public that shows up. And that's not something that's really tangible, but it's something that's very visual. Are our volunteers greeting those who come up? Do we have somebody at the front door? And was that effective in getting people from the front door to the table into the auditorium easily so that they weren't looking lost? Um, and that's just one example because we know that if somebody showed up to come to one of our events and no one was at the front door to greet them at a theater, there's, 10 different places they could go. They could get on their phone immediately, go on Facebook, and they could say, this movies for grown-ups was horrible because I didn't know where to go. No one was here to show me anything. And so that's just one simple example. So, in being proactive for minimizing anything like that, just having people in place to act as greeters, people in place to engage our audience as they come to the table, people in place to get them from the table to into the theater. How did that work? Um, a very
Well,
broad and vague example, but as you said, for each event, there's hundreds of types of examples.
and the chat has showed up and said, well, attendance, but I'm guessing that pure attendance is not the target for the free movies, movies for grown-ups. It would be engagement of some sort. And as you said, did they feel greeted, comforted? Was there any intentionality about talking about some other issues or touting AARP and so then the next question that came up is, do the volunteers know what the expectations are? And that's a universal question for any type of event.
Exactly. So that means that we have to make sure that when we are arranging the event or organizing the event, we have all those points covered and we provide clear instruction or direction or training so that volunteers know what it is they're expected to do. And this is also an opportunity for us as we have new volunteers joining some of those easy entry roles that can help a new volunteer or a prospective volunteer see where they fit in. They can be a greeter, they can be a greeter partner. So they can be at the front door as partners, and one can greet and one can then walk the guests to the table. Um, and so that kind of service can be explained as the volunteer roles are assigned. And all those things make a greater impact on someone coming to our events. And as we're walking, we can, just listen or answer any questions that someone might have about AARP, because a lot of times when people come to our events, they may have some comments about the insurance that they have that's covered by AARP, or those kind of things, so we can help clarify some questions to some dialogue that they may be having on the way to the table to get registered. But all of those are things that, as we're planning the event, we need to be clear so that volunteers can easily do those things.
Yeah, an awful lot of times, I know like at church, when we have a volunteer-led event, the focus is almost always on the attendees. And yet the volunteers are AARP members also, and they ought to have an exceptional experience, just like the attendees do. And if they don't, then you're going to lose volunteers. Or by providing an exceptional experience, you stand to recruit additional volunteers.
And so, how can that be built in? And I think intentionally, just a public thank you of the volunteers, having them stand up and recognize the volunteers who are here supporting this event. Those kind of things go a long way. You're giving some really good food for thought, Rob. I thank you for this.
My pleasure.
Anyone else have any questions? Let me see. Do volunteers know what is expected? Trained, informed. I see what Annabelle put in the chat. Gathering feedback, surveys would be one way to evaluate, Andre says. And certainly we can do that in many ways, putting a QR code, on the table as they exit, giving them an opportunity to take a 1 or 2 question survey as they leave an event. Many times, if we collect the evaluation at the door or at the event or at the conclusion of the event, and we make it really simple, we'll get more feedback than if we say, take this and do it at home. A lot of times we send a survey via email after the event. We don't know how many people respond. We do get some responses, but how can you make it easier for the responses to come back from evaluations, number one? And how can you put just a little bit of, not a lot of pressure, but a little pressure? And so if it's done while it's clear in their mind what it is they experienced, and if they had a really good time, and if we make it really easy by a QR code that they can do on their phone, and we have volunteers helping those who need a little assistance to pull up that QR code survey on their phone and answer those 2 or 3 questions before they leave, we're going to get a better response. So that's one way to enhance what Annabelle says. Let me see. If not, then Andre mentioned a quick survey. Yes, 2 or 3 questions. Andre said setting goals and expectations in advance when planning the event. Did we meet those goals and expectations? And building that in, that we not only want to meet, but we want to exceed the expectations of the community about the event they come to. And I know anytime I plan or am involved in the planning of something, I want to provide more of an experience than the audience is expecting, in little ways. It doesn't have to be, in your face, exploding head kind of experiences, but it can just be little touches that make people think, that was really nice, or that, I really felt good about that. And there can be some, some really amazing and delightful things too. So I'm going to stop talking and get some feedback from the audience. Again, how should volunteer-led activities be evaluated? And what are some reasonable expectations for success when volunteers are involved? And how do we make certain that the expectations are developed fairly and communicated clearly with the volunteers? Some great input on the chat and from those of you who have contributed so far. But I know there's more. Anybody want to raise their hand? I see something Annabelle put in chat. Follow up prior to the event with volunteers regarding what is needed at the event. Yes.
And while people are thinking, I'd like to go back to one of the comments that Rob made, and that is how, as volunteers, would it make you feel positive? Because Rob, I think you mentioned, our volunteers are always going to be there and we want them to be there. So how do we make sure that they feel appreciated and that the whole process rewards their contribution? What would you think, Rob?
Well, before I retired, I spent 5 or 6 years redesigning the culture of my organization. I was the CEO.
Mm-hmm.
And there are books and books about the culture. And
Right.
if you're a restaurant or a gas station or whatever you are, you're not competing with other restaurants. You're competing with Disney. And, Disney has things like they have studied how far apart to put the trash cans before somebody will drop the paper rather than put it in a trash can. There are some simple things that come out of studies like this. If you say thank you and you say no problem, that suggests it was a problem, but I'm choosing to ignore it, as opposed to my pleasure. Absolutely. And if you go to Chick-fil-A, they will say my pleasure. They have been trained. It's a point of purpose. And so, is it likely that you can develop an exceptional culture like that in your volunteers as they turn over, as they have other things going on in their life, etc.? But you can certainly make suggestions and give them a worksheet, ways to increase the experience rather than just provide basic service.
Great. Thank you. I think some of those points are things that we know, but we don't always remember at a time when it's critical and we've got to figure out what we're going to do next. Now,
And I think, as Rob said, just the change of a simple word between no problem and my pleasure
right.
Can have a whole different impact on someone's experience. And those are free. I mean, that's something that we can freely do easily. So thank you for asking that question or pointing that out, Deborah. And thank you, Rob, for expounding on that. We've had a few people join us. If you want to add your state behind your name so we know who's in the room, or just put it in chat and Deborah and I will make that adjustment for you. So I've asked one more question to provide any best practices that you may use in your state to evaluate volunteer efforts, because we always like to have tools that we can share amongst each other. And I know that there are some that exist. And if you have either a link to a document, or if you have a document to share that you want to share afterwards, you can send it to Deborah or I, and we can make sure that it's attached in the portal to this recording. Gloria, I see your hand. What's going on in Florida?
I apologize for not showing my face, but believe me, you will appreciate me not showing my face. I run a little bit different thing than like Movies for Grownups. I have an onboarding team here in South Florida, And that comprises of Broward and Miami-Dade and Monroe County. So it's a really big area. And I've split it in between Broward and Miami-Dade because of the vast different, the miles apart. If we want to then follow up and maybe meet for coffee with a prospect or something, if there's not so many miles to drive. But what they do is a process, and it's like a month-long process. We don't give up. If someone doesn't become a volunteer right away, or if they don't respond, we keep phoning them, texting them, emailing them, whatever way we can reach them. So for them, it's, I found it was like being personal when someone just wouldn't respond. They were feeling like they were failures somehow, but we know across the country that it's a fairly low percentage, maybe 20%. And we, once we find someone who's excited about being a volunteer, that's when we really need to zero in on them and help them become a volunteer. So how do we measure that is basically they either follow the process or they don't. If they don't, and they just haven't had time to make those phone calls, make those texts, make those whatever, then that tells me that they're not that committed to that position. But those that are, go over and above and make sure that people receive the application, make sure that they've had the training on we do training in Florida on Zoom across the state. So, and how do I evaluate them and I praise them, and I let them know when someone has done an exceptional job. It's across the group, and we meet regularly. That was a mistake I made for a year or so. We weren't meeting regularly. We were meeting when we could. And that wasn't enough, because by meeting regularly, they can share best practices with each other. They can say, in my case, here in Miami, this worked better. And then someone from another area could say, well, that didn't work for me, but here's what I found to be so. So we have so many different roles in our volunteers, and many of them do multiple things. And I hope that everyone that does this process really appreciates how valuable they are to the organization. And I try to stress that at all times.
Well, thank you for that contribution. Yes, and yes. It sounds like your team is doing a phenomenal job at not only reaching out and identifying, helping to identify that the need to continue to connect with the volunteers, but do it. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead.
One more thing.
Mhm.
That's one thing that we do. One thing that just started, and I didn't do this. Everybody knows Thai House Share, and we were recognizing that there's like a core group of volunteers in both counties that are kind of doing everything, and we wanted some way to recognize them. So we are starting. We started in the fourth quarter in 2024, and then as a test, and then we'll work on it each quarter to see how many times and how much effort these volunteers in these various groups. So we'll monitor that and see how it works. But there's going to be drawings for prizes, and they're going to be appreciated at our monthly meeting. So we'll have to see how this is going to shake out. But I hope that that it encourages more volunteers to participate more. That's the goal.
Well, great. And those incentives sound amazing. And I agree with the regular meeting, because some people need to have the ability to put it in their schedule and know that even if they can't attend, that it's going on and they can reach out to someone who's there. Or if it just so happens that their schedule frees up, they know when that meeting is and they can pop in. So I think a regular meeting time is a wonderful way to keep volunteers connected. Deborah has put um, some information in that Jackie Boland from Hawaii provided because she wasn't able to attend. So I encourage you to look at the chat and perhaps even save the chat so that you can have that, because I'm certainly not going to read that to you because you don't want to hear me saying all that. But Hawaii always has some tremendous and innovative ways that they not only engage the community, but engage and support their volunteers. And I am going to have to leave because I have a staff meeting in my job that I am responsible for showing up at on my other computer. It starts at 2:30. So Deborah, I'm going to let you take it away. I'm going to remain in the room, but I'm going to kind of mute because I just like the energy that this exchange provides. So I want to say happy holidays to everyone. And it was so good spending this time with you. And I look forward to seeing you all in 2025. Deborah, you know how much I care about this event, and mainly because I get to share co-leading with you. So thank you so much. And I'll see you all next year.
All right. Thank you, Mary.
Oh.
And of course, we just totally appreciate the energy that and knowledge that Mary brings to these meetings. Wanted to just again reiterate that what I've put in the chat is when I sent out the 330 emails that go out to everyone to tell them that this meeting is going to occur, I get comments back from people who
get food from last time, the snacks. And then I got popcorn. So if anyone's in the building and they want to come upstairs.
Who's talking? Okay, that must be some, it must have been on Mary's. Sounds like they were having popcorn somewhere. But in any case, I get comments like these back from things that I'm not going to be here, but perhaps here's something that I can share. And one of the things that I'm going to ask Jackie to do, not only did she provide comments that I think will be useful to people, and feel free, click on it, save it, whatever. But she's also indicated that she's developed a checklist that includes her goal statements and objectives at the outset of the various events. And she's something that's basically a template. And they do that as a part of the event planning. And then they also go into an after action review. And that's something that I know it's just hard for a lot of us to do, simply because we're so glad to get the event over. I'm not really sure that people are ready immediately after to talk about what went well, what didn't go so well. You'll get a few people who say that, but sometimes it's just hard getting the event done. So I'd like to encourage people to, when we get this information, we're going to, share it. We'll put it out on the chatter group so you can have it and figure out what makes sense for you. But one of the questions that I have going forward is, when you've got volunteers who are leading events, do you ever have the opportunity provided for them to have something like a listening table for the volunteers? And this gets back again to what Rob was talking about, which is building that culture of committed volunteers, that they get something out of the process, not just volunteering, but figuring out how they help going forward. Does anybody do anything like that? Or, as Jackie was mentioning here, is there some kind of an after action review or a debrief that does occur for volunteers.
Hi, Deborah. This
Hi,
is
Ms.
Ernestine
Ernestine.
Jackson.
Yes.
I do an after event report to staff, but I want to back up a minute. The reason I've been quiet is because when you talk about volunteer-led events, do the staff know that there are volunteer-led events, or are we being voluntold? And I'm fussy a little bit. We've been through a couple of staff changes, and prior to the last two, volunteer events were very good. Our volunteers are basically divided by activity or event. So we have a fraud team. We call them sub-teams. There's a volunteer team, and then there are sub-teams. There's a there's a fraud team. There's a caregiving team, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And each of those teams have co-leaders, and they are able to work with volunteers. It does not mean that any one volunteer can only be in one team, but there is a connection, and they meet as small groups. And then we meet as a large group, like quarterly. That helps. Some of the things we've done, like we have a volunteer recruitment event called Stepping Out, Stepping Up, where people are encouraged to come and find out what we're doing. That's volunteer led. But the volunteers also lead presentations based on their topic. They know who on their team is capable and who needs to be trained and how to support them. And we start with the understanding that most volunteers have had careers. They're not stupid. They walk in the door with experience and knowledge, and they simply want to engage in the community in a responsible way. When we do events, one of the things that we also do is we feed the volunteers before we feed the public or before we open the doors, so that the volunteers are not competing with the guest for food. They stay on their post, they're engaged, and they're not worrying about whether there's going to be something left for them to eat. So those are just a few of the things that we do. And then we acknowledge them with thank yous and you did a great job and da da da, you know, celebration.
Okay.
Briefly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Ernestine. One of the things that Rob mentioned, and I know I keep going back to you, Rob, but that was about building a culture and keeping that culture going. Just wanted those of you who may not be a part of the Volts, I don't know how many of you are, but starting in the coming year, there is going to be a rollout of something called the AARP way. And in part, that is being done because people coming into AARP may have had different experiences related to how volunteers work in the system and how you work with them. So as Ms. Ernestine said a while ago, we're getting lots of new staff as well as we get new volunteers. And if we don't have the chance to roll out to staff and volunteers the culture that says volunteers are important, volunteers get the work done, they need to be supported, that culture tends to disintegrate. So that's something that's going to be rolling out starting in February, I think is when they're encouraged to do it. And it's already, they're just 4 videos and some guides for people to use to talk among their community teams and among the staff to make sure that they understand that it's important when you are a volunteer or your staff working with volunteers, that it's important to support those volunteers. And that is the AARP way. Miss Ernestine, you've got your hand up again.
That's a great point. I'm glad they're doing that because in the last 18 months or so, we've lost significant volunteers because they felt they were not respected, were not appreciated. Um, and they just go, oh, I'm done. And that's unfortunate for many reasons, because volunteers are also of the community, and volunteers are also the clientele. They are the people we're supposed to be engaging with. So it does not sit well when people leave because they feel they have been disrespected.
Yeah. Well, Miss Linda, you hadn't said anything, but you certainly have looked like you wanted to a couple of times here.
No, I've just been enjoying listening to what other people are saying and realizing that I need to be talking to my advisory committee and ask them, it's kind of a mixed bag of how much feedback you want, how much feedback you can actually make a difference with, and without stepping on toes. And I'm hearing some of that as an undertone with some of the comments that are being made. We all want to encourage our volunteers and find out how things are going, but at the same time, there are procedures in place that have to be followed. So, it gets a little, if you're asking for feedback, you need to make sure that it's related just to that particular activity rather than to AARP, because
Right.
it's a huge organization and it's very
Yes.
difficult to, make things happen. So I don't know that that's part of the AARP way or not, but it definitely is something in the mix.
Right. And I can say it is a part of the thought process for it, because I was on the group that helped to put it together. Simply because it was a staff and volunteer effort. So you can't very well talk about how volunteers and staff are going to relate together if you don't have people on the teams working. So that's the way it was created. And, yeah, I'm sure it's not perfect, but it at least gets us to thinking about how do we do that? And, there's that broader picture, Linda, as you were talking about, but then to make it useful for us, we've got to take it down to those individual activities that we're working on, and how do we make those rewarding for people? Because if there's not enough for them to do, and as someone said, if they don't feel appreciated, there are lots of other places to go work, and we need
Absolutely.
to keep them as much as possible. And I think that's going to be a big emphasis going forward this year, is how do we engage and deepen those engagements of volunteers? How do we just make sure that, they're not even going to think about wanting to go someplace else, because we're just so good to them and with them. So any other comments today? Oh, Miss Josephine, you've got your hand up.
Hello. Well, having done a lot of work in the community, that's my background. I understand very well that when we enter a community and when we're trying to engage people in the work that we are doing, we need to keep in mind that we don't make assumptions that these folks don't know anything about what we're doing. I think that's number one. And that shows respect. It shows the folks that you are trying to work with, that you're trying to have them join in the rhythm of the work that you're doing, as opposed to saying, come on in, you do X, you do B, see you later, thank you. So how do you engage folks? And when you're working with volunteers, people want to help, but they may not understand how to help. And so I think when you're first working and talking to folks, I think a big piece is establishing rapport, sharing information to empower these folks and ensure that they understand what the issue is, and then have those listening sessions that we keep talking about so that we are hearing from the community and from the volunteers how they see the solution working out. Because at the end of the day, what we want volunteers to do is help us address an issue, right? So how do we see how do we support and empower volunteers to find solutions from within their group? We, of course, are going to provide the structure and the guidance, but we want volunteers to feel empowered. We want them to feel like they have an opportunity to tell us what's going to work for them and for other people in the community as well, as opposed to making them feel like we have our own agenda and we're going to shove it down and they're going to like it. So how do you work with people, right? How do you engage them along from the beginning, from the point of contact? How do you say, hello, this is who I am. This is what we're working on. We want to hear what your thoughts are, what has worked. Let's not assume that they don't know what's going on. Let's hear what's been happening in the community. They know better than any of us. They know what the solutions are. And with their help, that's the only way that we're going to be able to do any of the work that we're trying to get done. So we need to empower them, make them feel like they're part of the process, like they own it, engage them in every aspect of it, and compliment, thank people at every opportunity. Set very short steps, attainable steps for volunteers, and celebrate those at every opportunity. Thank you for this. Thank you for that. Woohoo, we did that. Celebrate all the small victories, and you'll get people really engaged.
Okay. Well, thank you, Josephine. Are there any other comments for today? I know I've got one more question, and this is kind of a fun one. If budget constraints, and this is not necessarily a good year to talk about budget, but if budget constraints were not a barrier, what would you try in support of your volunteers? Anyone have something you'd like to throw out? What would you like to do? Money's no object. I see smiles, but
If money were no object, I think we'd want to address some of the basic things and the obstacles to engaging volunteers, and those things include things like travel, coupons for travels, for the bus, for a bus ride to get to a location, a meal so that they can buy a meal while they're out. Little things like that, those are things that are really important to people who are looking to share their gifts, but have, very limited resources.
okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Josephine. Anyone else have a suggestion?
I think the gift cards are a really great idea too. And that's something that we do, but if we had more, I would be distributing more, and making sure folks had it for buying things at the grocery store, whatever it may be. Not just occasionally, but more often. I mean, you could the sky's the limit with the sorts of things that I could think of, but thinking practically,
Okay.
I think that that's probably one of the things that I enjoy receiving. Not necessarily a trinket or a toy, but something like that that I can use to get a meal, or everybody here gets a dinner, for as a group, doing those kinds of things.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. And I know during recognition time, we've had questions about sometimes people don't want the pins that come, they don't, and then other people love those. So it's how do we make sure that everything that's offered is something that people will appreciate, and that gets back to the listening. We've got to find ways always to make sure that we're listening to people and that we're providing them the opportunity to use their skills in a way that benefits them and the organization, that they've got the appropriate training and the appropriate support. It's the last thing I'm going to say is that when I started, having been in accounting and being in management for all those years, I said, I don't want to manage anything. I'll come and I will type behind the scenes. I'll, stand and hand out keychains or do something else, but I don't really want to manage anything. But little by little, I found ways to do it that did not mean that I was taking over and running the entire operation kind of thing, that I was working with other volunteers, and that was good. And I'm fine with it now, but I wanted to back away after all of those years. And I know that there are people coming across like that. And then there are others who've never had that opportunity to be in charge. Here's their chance, So I had a new person that we were orienting in Kentucky the other day, and they're looking so forward to being someone who can be that leader going forward after they learn, they understand, but they want to do those things. So we've got to be responsive to the people who are coming across and making it useful for them. So thank you all very much for your time today. I wanted to say, as Dr. Mary did, that you all have been just a wonderful group of support. You continue to share information and create those ideas that are making it's amazing what happens after this meeting. There's always somebody who gets with somebody else to talk about what happened or ask them, and they hadn't thought about it before. So thank you all very much. We're going to continue this one more year, and that'll be year 7 in 2025. We've got a form out there if you want to put some suggestions for topics. That's going to be open until December 31st. If you get the OVE update, the link for that was included. I also included it in the last meeting. I will send it back out again to people to make sure that you've got it. And, a suggestion is fine, because otherwise you're stuck with what comes up to me at 2 o'clock at night. So, okay. But thank you all very much for being patient, being here, and being contributors. I really appreciate it. And happy holidays to all of you. Look forward to seeing you and the rest of your friends in January. Yes.
Happy holidays to all.
Thank you. Goodbye.